It was a warm Friday evening in late summer. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden glow across the small southern town of Mason Grove. The streets were bustling with the sounds of locals heading out to dinner, shopping, or simply enjoying the weekend atmosphere. For the Parker family, it was an evening they had looked forward to for weeks. Mr. Parker, a hardworking accountant, had just been promoted to senior regional manager at his firm, and it was no small feat. He'd spent years working his way up, often being overlooked for promotions he deserved, but finally his dedication had paid off. He, his wife Leah, and their two children, 15-year-old Maya and 12-year-old Jamal, were dressed in their best clothes, ready for a celebratory dinner at the finest restaurant in town, the White Oak Bistro. Leah smiled as she adjusted Jamal's collar. "You look so handsome, baby." "Thanks, Mom," Jamal said, squirming slightly, embarrassed by the attention but pleased by the compliment. Maya rolled her eyes playfully. "Don't embarrass him, Mom." Mr. Parker laughed and shook his head. "Everyone ready? Big night tonight." They were all excited to eat at the restaurant. The White Oak Bistro was known for its elegant setting and gourmet meals, but it was also known for something else, something unspoken yet understood by many people of color in the town. The place had an aura about it, a kind of invisible barrier that made families like the Parkers feel unwelcome. Still, they wanted to believe that things were changing, that this town was progressing, and tonight was supposed to be a happy occasion. They pulled up to the restaurant and stepped out of the car, feeling the stares of passers-by almost immediately. Leah squeezed her husband's hand, offering him a reassuring smile. "Ignore them. This is our night." As they approached the door, the hostess, a tall blonde woman with sharp features and an icy expression, barely glanced at them. Her eyes skimmed over them dismissively before she forced a tight-lipped smile. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, though the question sounded more like an accusation. "Yes, under Parker," Mr. Parker replied, his tone calm but firm. The hostess scanned the book in front of her, pretending to search for the name, though her disinterest was obvious. After a painfully long pause, she sighed and nodded. "Right this way." As they were led to their table, the family could feel the weight of eyes on them. Other patrons whispered to each other, glancing at the Parkers as if they were out of place, intruding on an unspoken rule. But the Parkers held their heads high, determined to enjoy the night. They were seated near the back of the restaurant, far from the other guests. Mr. Parker exchanged a glance with Leah, silently noting the slight but choosing to brush it off for now. It was an old familiar feeling, being set apart, kept at a distance. Once seated, their waiter arrived. He too seemed hesitant as he handed out menus, avoiding eye contact with them. His tone was clipped as he went through the specials of the evening, rattling them off as if he couldn't wait to leave their table. "Thank you," Mr. Parker said, trying to maintain the warmth in his voice. The waiter grunted something unintelligible before walking away quickly, leaving the family in a strange, uncomfortable silence. Maya broke it first. "Do they always treat people like this?" Mr. Parker sighed and rubbed his temples. "Sometimes, sweetheart, sometimes." Leah reached across the table, taking her husband's hand. "We're not going to let them ruin our night. This is about celebrating you, remember?" He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're right. Let's make the best of it." But making the best of it proved difficult. The waiter was slow to return, and when he finally did, it was with an impatient glare as though serving the Parkers was the last thing he wanted to do. He took their orders quickly, scribbling down notes with barely concealed frustration, and rushed off without so much as a word of acknowledgement. As the minutes dragged on, the Parkers noticed other tables receiving their meals, even those who had arrived long after them. Leah's brow furrowed, and Jamal fidgeted uncomfortably in his seat. Maya, ever the observant teenager, shot her parents a look of confusion. "This isn't right, Dad," she said quietly. "They're ignoring us on purpose." Mr. Parker's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the owner of the restaurant, Mr. Johnson, walked over. Tall and imposing, with graying hair and a deep scowl etched into his face, he strode up to their table with an air of authority. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent as he approached. "Can I help you?" Mr. Parker asked, his tone polite but cautious. Mr. Johnson didn't bother with pleasantries. "You folks need to leave," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. Leah blinked in disbelief. Excuse me? We haven't even eaten yet. You're violating the dress code, Johnson said, eyeing them up and down with disdain. Mr. Parker looked down at his neatly pressed suit and tie, then at his wife's elegant dress and the kids' well-put-together outfits. What dress code? We're dressed appropriately, Johnson sneered. This is a fine establishment, not some fast food joint. I'm asking you to leave now, before I call the police. The tension in the air was suffocating. Maya's eyes widened in shock, and Jamal looked like he was on the verge of tears. Leah's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. Sir, Mr. Parker began, keeping his voice steady despite the anger boiling beneath the surface. We've done nothing wrong. We're paying customers, just like everyone else here. Johnson's expression darkened. I don't care. You're not welcome here. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder, the whispers of the other patrons cutting through the air like knives. Some were amused, others curious, but none spoke up in defense of the Parkers. The weight of judgment, of being an outsider, crashed down on them in full force. Leah stood, grabbing her purse. We'll go. We don't need to stay where we're not wanted. Mr. Parker hesitated, his fists clenched at his sides, but eventually nodded. He stood, taking his wife's hand as he helped Maya and Jamal to their feet. Together they walked toward the door, the eyes of the entire restaurant following them. Just as they reached the door, it swung open, and in walked a man who seemed to command the room without saying a word. Tall, with broad shoulders and a sharply tailored suit, he was black, with skin as dark as night and an air of quiet confidence that drew everyone's attention. Mr. Parker didn't recognize him immediately, but something about the way the man carried himself made it clear that he was someone important. He nodded politely to the family as they passed, offering them a brief but meaningful look before turning his attention to the restaurant. The Parkers stepped outside, their hearts heavy, but curiosity got the better of them. They stopped just a few feet from the door, watching as the man approached Mr. Johnson, who was still standing near the table the Parkers had just vacated. Good evening, the man said, his voice deep and smooth. Johnson, still caught up in his own self-righteousness, barely glanced at him. We're full, he snapped. You'll have to leave. The man raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining calm. You don't know who I am, do you? Johnson rolled his eyes. I don't care who you are. I said we're full. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, that's unfortunate, because I'm the new owner of this restaurant chain. Johnson's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as if someone had just punched him in the gut. He stammered, his mouth opening and closing without sound, completely caught off guard. The man folded his arms, his smile fading as he spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. I bought this chain a month ago, and I came here tonight to see how things were running. I didn't expect to witness such blatant racism. Johnson's hands shook, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for someone to help him out of the mess he'd just created. But no one came to his aid. The other patrons, who had been watching with morbid curiosity, now stared in the stunned silence. Sir, I didn't know, Johnson stuttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Didn't know what? The man replied, his voice dangerously low. That treating black customers like second-class citizens is wrong? The silence in the restaurant was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were on Mr. Johnson, who now looked like a man who had just realized he was in far too deep. Mr. Parker, the man called out suddenly, turning toward the door where the Parkers stood, frozen in place. Would you and your family come back inside, please? Hesitant at first, Mr. Parker exchanged glances with Leah, unsure if this was some sort of trick or misunderstanding. But there was sincerity in the man's voice, a firmness that suggested he wasn't just offering them a meal, he was offering them the respect they deserved. Slowly, they re-entered the restaurant. As they did, the man addressed the room. This family came here tonight to celebrate a special occasion, and instead of being welcomed with the dignity every paying customer deserves, they were humiliated and asked to leave because of the color of their skin. Johnson's face burned red, but he remained silent, too ashamed to even attempt an explanation. The man gestured to an empty table, one of the best in the house, positioned near the grand piano where soft jazz played. Mr. Parker, Mrs. Parker, please have a seat. Tonight your meal is on me. Leah hesitated. We don't want any trouble. There won't be any trouble, the man assured her. Not anymore. The Parkers sat down, still feeling the eyes of the other patrons on them. But this time, those eyes held something different. There was no longer judgment or disdain. There was shame. The other diners now realized that they had stood by and allowed an injustice to take place, and none of them had spoken up. The man turned back to Johnson. As for you, your services are no longer required. You're fired. Johnson's eyes widened in horror. Wait, please. I've worked here for years. You've worked here for years and still thought it was acceptable to treat people like this? The man shook his head. This is not the kind of business I want to run. Johnson tried to plead his case, but the man was unmoved. He signaled to a nearby security guard, who stepped forward and escorted Johnson out of the building. The restaurant remained eerily quiet, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. As the Parkers' meal arrived, prepared with extra care by the kitchen staff who had witnessed the entire event, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The jazz music filled the silence, and soon the sound of quiet conversations returned to the room. The man who introduced himself as Marcus Thompson, the new CEO of the restaurant chain, sat with the Parkers for a few minutes, apologizing on behalf of his company for the way they had been treated. He explained that he was in town to evaluate the restaurant and was horrified by what he had witnessed. Mr. Parker shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. You didn't have to step in like that, but I appreciate it. Thompson smiled. I did have to. We all have to. If we don't stand up against this kind of behavior, it just continues. The rest of the meal was filled with light-hearted conversation, laughter, and a renewed sense of warmth. The Parkers were able to enjoy their night, knowing that they had not only been vindicated, but had also seen justice served in a way they hadn't expected. As they left the restaurant, the same eyes that had judged them now watched with admiration and perhaps a bit of guilt. The Parkers held their heads high, knowing that something had shifted that night. They had come to celebrate a promotion, but they left having witnessed something far more important, a small victory in the ongoing fight against racism. The next day, news of the incident spread throughout Mason Grove. The story of how a black family had been mistreated at the White Oak Bistro, only for the racist owner to be fired on the spot by a black CEO, quickly became the talk of the town. Some people were shocked, others outraged, but most were relieved that change was finally starting to happen in their small community. The restaurant's new management implemented strict anti-discrimination policies, ensuring that everyone, regardless of race, was treated with the respect they deserved. And as for the Parkers, their story became a symbol of hope and justice, a reminder that sometimes standing up to discrimination isn't just about fighting back. It's about showing others that it has no place in the world we all share,